and then we'll go into our support meeting where we can talk and share either about this presentation or about anything else that you'd like to talk about tonight. So tonight we welcome Professor Tom Hooper from York University. Tom uses he, him pronouns. He's a historian, a teacher, a researcher, an activist, and a writer. He's a historian of Toronto's bathhouse raids, the subject of tonight's presentation. And along with other colleagues, Tom managed the Anti-69 Network, a movement dedicated to challenging the federal government's portrayal of the 1969 legislation addressing homosexuality. And that encompassed some of his presentation that he shared with us back in October. In 2018, Tom testified at the Parliamentary Justice Committee calling for an end to the laws that led to the continued discrimination and persecution of queer people after 1969. At the committee, he described the laws as archaic, and I quote, and perhaps my favorite parliamentary committee quote of all time, I mean really archaic, indecent acts, vagrancy, body house laws. This is like the antique roadshow of criminal code. And it certainly is. And every time I read that line, I giggle. So thank you for that in history, written into parliamentary history, Tom Hooper. We'll leave the floor to you, Tom, to talk about 10 interesting facts about the Toronto bathhouse raids. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for repeating that line from my testimony. It was my favorite too. I came up with that line sitting there with Gary Kinsman, who's another historian and scholar and activist who was quite active during the 1981 bathhouse raids. We were sitting there for lunch in the parliamentary cafeteria next to Mike Duffy, by the way, who at that point was going through a whole bunch of problems. And that's where I came up with that line. So, and I just thought, this is gonna, I have to say something here that's gonna make them pay attention, because these politicians, they sit through deputations all day. I need to wake them up. And so that line kind of got them. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'm here. I'm going to share my screen because, I'm not allowed to right now. So maybe as I talk, the host will let me do that. But as a good professor, I've prepared a PowerPoint. And I'm calling the talk today Toronto Bathhouse Raids 101. So that's going to be the sort of idea behind what it is that I'm doing here. So where's my clicker? And I've posted my contact info there on that slide, but perhaps Tristan can make my contact info available after the meeting to your group. I'm happy to take questions. And if you know anyone who was part of the bathhouse raids, was part of the protests, anything like that, please have them contact me, because I'm currently writing a book on the bathhouse raids. And one of the missions that I have in writing this book is expanding the number of people that I've talked to who lived through this experience. It's really important to get those voices down. I've tried to do that as best I could, and I'm going to talk about some of those voices in my presentation today. So my clicker isn't working, so I'll just use my mouse, which is good. So the key facts. Let's just get some key facts put out there for us all to know. So this occurred, this bathhouse raid, the Toronto bathhouse raid, occurred at 11 p.m. on Thursday, February 5th, 1981. There were 4 bathhouses that were raided that night by 200 police agents, some of them in uniform, some of them undercover or in plain clothes. 286 bathhouse patrons were arrested, and 20 bathhouse owners and employees were arrested. This was one of the largest mass arrests in Canadian history. At that point, it was really the FLQ crisis that was the largest mass arrest before this. Since then, it's been superseded by some other notable events, including the G20 here in Toronto. But in 1981, this was one of the largest mass arrests in Canadian history. I'm going to ask the question, I'm going to ask several questions, and these are the questions that commonly get asked about the bathhouse raids. And one of those questions is, what is a bathhouse? I think because this event has been so notable in our history, when it gets talked about, I find a lot of things get glossed over. It's just assumed that everybody has heard about the bathhouse raids and knows about them, but that's not actually true. So many times I've done talks like this, and I've had people come up to me and say, "I've never heard of this. This is incredible." So let's all just start from the basics. What is a gay bathhouse? Well, in the 19th and 20th centuries, in urban centers across North America, Turkish, Finnish, other Eastern European cultures who immigrated to these urban centers, they brought with them this public bathing culture. And to service those communities, these Turkish, Finnish saunas were created. These saunas were characterized by gender separation. So men and women, they would be separated within the premises and they would bathe separately. What I have shown in the image here is a floor plan of the barracks bathhouse. Now you'll see in the floor plan, there's two entrances down near the bottom there. One of those, in the original design of this bathhouse, this was a Finnish bath. The men would enter on the right and the women would enter on the left. And because of the design of the bathhouse, it was dark and it had all of these little locations that were around, like the shower room. Let's see if I can enlarge this a little bit for us. So here on the first floor, you had a locker area and you had a shower room and a lounge, and then all of these sort of dark winding corridors with tiny rooms, tiny cubicle rooms that allowed you some privacy. And so the design of this space was for men and women to come in, to bathe, and then to go and seek some rest or some respite. So that's the design of the bathhouse, and that's how it was created, and that's sort of the layout. This unintentionally created opportunities for same-gender intimacy. So you've got all of the men separated. They're in this dark space with winding corridors and private spaces. Everyone is naked or either dressed in towels. And so this unintentionally created these opportunities for intimacy. And when we look at the history of these baths in the 19th and 20th centuries across North America, we see little tiny instances where two men or two women have been caught engaging in basically illicit sexual activities for the time. By 1981, though, several of these bathhouses, and this started in the 1960s, they started transitioning to being not designed for public bathing, but instead were designed to cater specifically to a gay clientele for the purposes of hooking up. So this is what a bathhouse is, and this is what a bathhouse was in 1981. They largely serve the same purpose today with similar layouts and similar amenities. So why go to a gay bathhouse? And I just have a little clip I'm going to play in the background here as I talk. There are several reasons why you might go to a gay bathhouse. Obviously, the first reason is going to be sex. So sex is the primary reason why gay men go there. There were, several of the men, once they were charged, they tried to say, oh, I just went there for the sauna. I had bronchitis and I needed the steam room to clear it up. That may have been the case sometimes, but by and large, the main reason why men went to a bathhouse was for sex. But in addition to that motivation, you had all of these other reasons that brought men into the gay baths. It was an escape. So for men, especially who were living in the closet, who weren't living openly, who were married, had families, the bathhouse was an escape. They could be anonymous. They could go into the bathhouse as one person, come out looking like the same person. They can do whatever they want in those hour or two that they're in there, and they come out and nobody knows, and no one's the wiser. So this was an escape, and it was a private escape. It was also a space of liberation. So for the community of openly gay men who was moving downtown Toronto and developing this sense of open public community, the bathhouses represented liberation. It was, the perfect space. It was the space they envisioned would be created as a result of their sexual liberationist political agenda. So bathhouses were also a space of sexual liberation. There were also relaxation. So you saw in the clip there were, little pools and hot tubs and saunas and steam rooms. This was a space to chill out, go to after work or after the bar and relax, unwind. It was also a space of community. So the regulars who went there, kind of like the bar Cheers, where everybody knows your name, a similar kind of environment was created around these spaces. The regulars who showed up, they got to know each other. They would recognize each other. They would check in on each other. So these were also spaces of community. And by the way, that clip that I showed you is from a documentary called Track 2 that was produced in 1982 and largely documents the experience of the bathhouse raids using footage from the time. So this is available on YouTube in full. So I encourage you to check out that documentary, Track 2, Enough is Enough. So that's why men went into the bathhouses. I want to talk about 4 men who I interviewed. Each one was in a different one of the bathhouses. That's why I've picked these 4 specifically. So the first is Ron Roseness. As Tristan mentioned at the start here, I attended Parliament and I advocated for law reform. I did not do that alone. I was there with, as I mentioned before, Gary Kinsman, but I also was there with Ronald Roseness. And he was such a strong voice, an important voice for us on these efforts in order to take it from bathhouse raids as the abstract to saying, no, here's a guy who was charged and convicted, and as a result, his record should be wiped clean. So that's the argument we made because Ron, stuck his neck out for us. Not only did he testify, but he helped me obtain the police records. So I've been able to fill in gaps in the historical narrative as a result of these police records, which I've shown here. This is his record of arrest, and it included some additional documentation detailing the evidence that they collected. So that was incredibly helpful. You'll notice here, by the way, just while I'm talking about his record of arrest, the issue of race, when it came to race by the Toronto police, the public was broken down into 5 categories. So your race was either white, black, yellow, red, or brown. Those were the race categories. That's how the Toronto police saw the racial diversity of the city of Toronto during this time. So Ron was a frequent bathhouse patron. He lived in the city, so he lived nearby the baths. He was openly gay. And for him, this was sexual liberation. This was a space where he could go, be himself, enjoy his sexuality, and create this sense of community. He knew several of the men who were there that night, and so he in fact played a supporting role for several of the people who were charged. I think Ron, he was more confident in his sexuality, and so that's why he has become this activist that's now using that confidence to try to help other people's lives better, and to make law reform. So that's sort of been Ron's steady story throughout this whole thing, both in 1981 and now. So for him, the baths were liberating. It was a sense of community. And at the moment, at 11 o'clock p.m., he was sitting by himself, simply enjoying a moment of silence and a moment of peace. He had rented a room. He was by himself in the room, and that's when the police agents busted through the doors. Arthur is a sweetheart, a very sweet man, and this is the first time I'm talking about Arthur since he has left us, since he's passed. So I miss Arthur, and it's hard for me to talk about him because he's a good friend, and I curled with him a few times, and he was just a very wonderful person. And so he agreed to meet with me and get interviewed and to give me his story of the baths. So he was married. So that's why I say this was a difficult interview for him. He lived in the suburbs in 1981, and he was living a busy life. He was a husband, he was a father, he was a member of his church, and they did so much that, in terms of the charity work and the volunteer work, he was so busy that going into the baths, which he did, maybe once every other month or something like that. It wasn't that often because he was so busy, but that was his moment just for him. He was doing all of this work, taking care of all these people and helping all these people. This was the moment for him. So going to the baths was an escape. And so he used this as an escape. And it was also his space of rest and relaxation. So at 11 o'clock p.m. for him, he was at the Club Toronto, the Club Baths, and he had previously met someone, but at this moment he was sitting by himself alone in the hot tub when the police busted through the doors. So Duncan McLaren is the next person I'm going to talk about. Duncan McLaren was in the barracks. So that's the floor plan I showed you a minute ago. Sorry, I should have mentioned Ron Roseness. He was at the Romans. So Ron was at the Romans, and then Duncan McLaren was at the barracks. So for Duncan, again, this was another instance where the bathhouses was a safe space of sexual expression for those who were in heterosexual relationships. And for him, when 11 o'clock happened, he was sitting in his room. He was socializing with a friend and neighbor. This wasn't an intimate encounter he was having. It was his actual neighbor from where he lives. He happened to run into at the baths. And so he was just sitting there catching up with his friend. His friend had cannabis and brought the cannabis over. And so they were both sort of sitting there smoking this joint. And as soon as the police busted in, Duncan was sort of caught holding it. So Duncan got swept up not only in the bathhouse charge, but also in the cannabis charge. And I'm just going to play quickly here a couple seconds of this clip of Duncan explaining when the police started raiding the barracks.
And then there was a sound. It was like an express train going by, or an earthquake. And I thought, what in God's name is happening? I thought it must be an earthquake because the entire building started to shake. And now my memories are kind of hazy as to what happened next because I was just in a state of shock. I couldn't imagine what this deafening sound was. It was a rumbling sound, almost like thunder. Anyway, suddenly there was.
So again, this clip is from Nancy Nickel and Stand Together, and this clip is housed at the archives. You can go watch the rest of what he has to say. One thing I'd like to highlight in what Duncan McLaren says in this clip and what he also talked to me about in my interview with him is once they had rounded all of the men at the barracks into the shower room, 3 cops were standing around watching over the group, making sure they weren't misbehaving, making sure they weren't running away. And they were joking with each other and they pointed at the shower heads. And one cop said to another, "It's too bad those aren't hooked up to gas." And so for Duncan McLaren, there was something about this that was really striking to sort of Nazi Germany and allusions to concentration camps and that level of fascism. And this was reported in the gay press in the weeks after the raids.
Bang.
So Tony is the last found-in, or he wasn't a found-in actually. He's the last man who was arrested that I'm going to talk about here. He was arrested at the Richmond Street Health Emporium. And so it's this, in the Richmond Street is the bathhouse that's shown in the clips from track 2. And I'll just let this one play as I talk here. So that's the Richmond Street. And Tony Fay was sitting in the lounge, and that's when the cops busted through the door. 2 undercover cops were already inside. They rushed the sort of reception area. They buzzed the door, and all of the cops rushed in and rounded everyone up for an arrest. Now, the thing with the Richmond Street Health Emporium is that more than $100,000 had been put into this place in renovations just a couple of months prior to this raid. And when the police went in, they went in with crowbars and they smashed through the doors. Yeah, every single door to every single cubicle was smashed in. The lockers were smashed in. And Tony was the supervisor at the Richmond Street Health Emporium. So he supervised the employees. He was finished work and was waiting in the lounge for his boyfriend. But when the raid happened, he was begging the police. He was pleading with them, take my keys. He had the master key to the whole place, take my keys and use that to open all the doors. The cops weren't there to open doors. They were there to kick the doors down. And as a result of the damage that was caused to the Richmond Street Health Emporium, it never opened again. In fact, the only time it opened again was to film this scene in track 2. So the raid was part of a larger police project called Operation Soap. So the idea here was the police needed to cleanse the city of these gay bathhouses. And this was a 6-month undercover investigation. I've shown here police documents that I was able to find, and they detail the various times in which investigative undercover police agents were sent into the baths, for how long they were there, and the types of things they were looking for and what they found. And this one bathhouse alone, this report was from the Romans. At one bathhouse, there were 17 undercover visits by 3 officers. They were in there for over 24 hours of observation time. And that's, times three officers at just one bathhouse. You're talking an hour and a half for each of these visits that they wandered around searching for these things. You can see in this list, they're looking for masturbation and buggery and oral sex and also other forms of gay sex. So this was what the police were looking for. And because they found these instances, they were able to come to the conclusion that the bathhouses were defined under criminal law as body houses. And they were body houses because of all of these illicit sex acts that the police could observe. So that's what the charges were. When it came to the men who were arrested and charged, they were charged under the criminal code body house law. There were 286 found-ins, as I mentioned at the start here. They were charged with being found in a common body house. These were the bathhouse patrons. All the customers were charged with being found in a common body house. It didn't matter. It didn't matter how the cops found you. So despite the fact that Ron was by himself in a closed-door room, it didn't matter. The fact that he was found inside the body house, that's the only material evidence related to the charge. Were you found in the body house? So that's why the law is called that, found in a common body house. And then the 20 keepers, they were charged with keeping a common body house. So these are the employees and the owners of the body houses, of the bathhouses rather. They were charged under this body house law. And this article here from the Body Politic, the Toronto's gay newspaper in 1981, sort of recognizes that the problem here is the body house law. And they called it here in this article, the state's key to the bedroom door. And just sort of supporting my argument on 1969, the first line here, which I'll make a bit bigger, it reads, most people think Pierre Trudeau's famous 1969 criminal code amendments had the effect of decriminalize homosexuality. They did not. So the body house law was at issue. The question is, what does the body house law have to do with the criminal code offenses relating to homosexuality? If you attended my last talk, you'll remember that those crimes were mainly gross indecency. So that's what I'm just going to explain here in this slide. So in 1892, that's when Canada's criminal code was adopted into law. And as part of that criminal code, it included both the body house law as well as the criminal offense of gross indecency. And it was gross indecency that outlawed gay sex. But the body house law, that was designed to apply to acts of prostitution, to brothels. That was the vision of this provision. In 1917, the body house law was amended. And that's because during World War I, in large urban centers, especially where soldiers were being mobilized, so in Toronto and Montreal, various brothels were operating under different sort of circumstances. They were calling themselves massage parlors. So they weren't quite brothels per se. And so the government expanded the definition of bawdy house law to include not only prostitution, but acts of indecency. So they use this sort of broad, vague language. But for the courts to determine what indecency means, they relied on that other criminal code offense, gross indecency. And that was the offense that was used to criminalize gay sex. So without even really knowing it, in 1917, the government amended the bawdy house law to include not only acts of prostitution, but also acts of gay sex. Now, that has implications in 1969 because, as I mentioned last time, no laws were removed from the criminal code in 1969. And the only thing that really happened was that they amended the law of gross indecency to allow gay sex to occur in the bedrooms of the nation. Well, that didn't include the bawdy houses or the bathhouses of the nation. And so in 1981, that's how we get the bathhouse raids. These acts of indecency in a common bawdy house were basically defined as all of these acts here that I showed you on this slide. So buggery, oral sex, masturbation, these are all considered acts of indecency under the bawdy house law. So when was the first bathhouse raid? Well, the first bathhouse raid in Toronto was in 1968 at the International Steam Bath. 30 men were charged. And again, these were under bawdy house offenses, but they also charged for gross indecency and counseling to commit gross indecency. I've put two articles up on the slide here, just because I'm a historian and I don't believe in coincidence. So the first story at the top here is from the Globe and Mail, September 7th, 1968. And in this article, it talks about how the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police were publicly opposing any changes that were being proposed to the laws against homosexuality. So they were opposed to the 1969 criminal code reform. A few weeks later, and you can count them if you want, we have Toronto's first bathhouse raid with 30 men facing morals charges. So to me, I see this as the police really trying to test the waters to see, okay, how can we get around this 1969 criminal code amendment and still criminalize LGBTQ2 people? And so that's what I surmise is what took place. Without getting access to police records, we'll never know. The first bathhouse raid that occurred in Canada, so outside of Toronto, we just discovered this actually because of some work of a local historian named Walter Cassidy, who discovered that the first gay bathhouse raid was in Windsor, Ontario in 1964 at the Edna Baths. So just a bit of trivia for you in case you ever get asked it. Nobody will know it because nobody knows it yet, but Walter Cassidy will publish that and we'll all understand when Canada's first bathhouse raid occurred. Were there other bathhouse raids? So yes, if you were at my last talk, you would have saw this this chart that I posted there. And this is all of the bathhouse raids that I've been able to count from 1968 to 2004. I'll have to amend it thanks to Walter and add that Windsor case back to 1964. But you'll see here that the bathhouse raids in Toronto in 1981, they weren't unique to Toronto and they weren't unique to 1981. They span most of the history of gay liberation in Canada. And in fact, a lot of the public battles between our community and the state occurred around these various raids. One raid in particular I'm going to highlight is number 15 here, where 146 men were arrested under the bawdy house law. That was in Montreal. And as a result of that raid, the community took to the streets in protest. They raised funds, they found gay-friendly lawyers, and they fought the charges in court. And the community in Toronto took note of that, and they learned from that. And that same model of activism was brought to Toronto from Montreal, and that explains how the community was so successful in resisting the bathhouse raids. So that's the next question. What was the response to the bathhouse raids? What happened afterwards? So activists were seasoned through the 1970s. The community faced so many different challenges and battles. There were challenges with the police. There were challenges with LGBTQ2 people being fired from their jobs. The religious right was rising, and sort of homophobic, the homophobic crusader in the US, Anita Bryant, for those who know your 1970s history, she came to Toronto and spread her anti-gay message here, her Save the Children message here in 1978. So the activists, they had been seasoned through the 1970s, and they weren't ready for this scale of a raid. Let's just put that out there. They were all caught off guard. But because of what they had gone through in the 1970s, they had developed the capacity to resist. None of them knew it at the time, but they had developed the capacity to resist. So they held two protests. The first was on February 6, 1981. The second was on February 20th, 1981. The February 6th protest is the one that people talk about the most, and it's what I have pictured here from the star, and also this image here down below here. The February 6th protest, when the activists organized that protest, they thought 50 people were going to show up, and instead 3,000 showed up. So this was a moment. It wasn't something that the activists created in that moment. It's something the activists had been building through the 1970s, and they didn't even know how much power they had until that night, until they went out to the street and they saw how many people were willing to put their bodies on the line to fight back. And that's exactly what happened. That mob was so angry that after marching all the way from the gay village down to 52 Division at Dundas University, they marched up University intent on, causing damage to Queen's Park. You can see in this picture, the doors to Queen's Park are just behind this line of police that are standing here. If those cops hadn't been able to race to Queen's Park and beat the mob, we talk about January 6th in the Congress, we may have had that happen here in 1981. In Ontario. So that was an angry mob, but it showed that the activist community had support and they had political power. And so this group that had previously been formed, called the Right to Privacy Committee, they formed in 1979 after a smaller bathhouse raid. And they adopted the model that was developed in Montreal. They raised funds, they connected the found-ins with gay-friendly lawyers, and they organized these protests. How did the police respond? Well, with more violence. So there were two more bathhouse raids in June 1981. And in response to those bathhouse raids was a protest on June 20th, 1981, that's commonly known as the bloodbath protest. The police came out with an intent to cause violence. And you can see some of the pictures here show that the violence was mainly caused because of this image that you see down below, where the crowd sat down at the intersection of Yonge and Bloor. And so as a result of that sit down, the police moved in and all hell broke loose, according to one of the activists I interviewed, and who ultimately was hospitalized because he was hit over the head with a billy club. So as a result of this additional raid and this additional police response, the date of the Pride March that had been planned for that year was moved from August to June. And it's also in 1981 that Pride incorporated as an organization, as an entity. So as a result of the bathhouse raids, Pride was created. And they moved it from August to June because they didn't want to have it mark the anniversary of the 1969 reforms, which came into effect in August. They wanted to mark the Stonewall riots in New York City in 1969, which was a riot against the police. And they wanted the Pride March to coincide with that protest against police violence. So that's the origin of the Toronto Pride Parade. the Right to Privacy Committee also was focused on law reform. And I'm just noticing my time. I don't want to take too much more. I only have a couple of more slides, and then I'll get to questions, and then you can get on to your meeting. So the Right to Privacy Committee succeeded on the law front in a few respects. They also were limited in a few respects as well. But 87% of the cases were withdrawn or acquitted. So by that, I'm talking about the 306 men that were arrested on February 5th, 1981, the 286 found-ins and the 20 keepers. 87% of those cases were acquitted or withdrawn. 13% were still convicted because, as I said, the law was actually on the police's side. The police had a legal pretext in order to carry out these raids because of the body house law. But because the Right to Privacy Committee found these really talented defense lawyers, they were able to come up with these legal strategies. For one, the police anticipated that making this many arrests, most of the men were just going to plead guilty in order to avoid any of the shame or publicity of a trial. They didn't count on the Right to Privacy Committee supplying so much support to the community so that so many people would want to plead not guilty and fight back. So there was issues with court capacity. In fact, a lot of the trials had to be shipped outside of downtown and over to Scarborough Courthouse. A lot of these cases weren't decided until the summer of 1982. So over a year and a half after the raids, because of so many people who pleaded not guilty. There was also difficulty in coordinating the witnesses because of the fact that cases were shipped out to Scarborough. You had cops not showing up, prosecution witnesses not showing up. And so a lot of charges were withdrawn because of that. But you also had weakness in police evidence. The police didn't think men were going to fight them, so they didn't take time to properly document the identity of the people they charged. And so if all they wrote in their notebook that, Ron has blonde hair and blue eyes, that's not going to cut it. So when someone like that would be on trial, the gay community organized and they packed the court with blonde hair and blue-eyed gay men. And they demanded that the cop point out the accused in the court, and the cop could not do it because they just did not take enough notes. They did not properly gather their police evidence. And so for those reasons, the cases were acquitted or withdrawn. Afterwards, the Right to Privacy Committee created this new group called Gay Court Watch, where gay activists actually sat in at court waiting for any case that involved gross indecency or the body house law to provide resources and to provide the ability to defend themselves. To the point that Gay Court Watch had an office in Old City Hall courtroom, not the courtroom, but the courthouse rather. They had an office that they rented there, which was incredible. And they had the docket slipped under the door every morning. Somebody would be there to catch any of the gay cases that were proceeding. They also tried to repeal the body house law. And I've put the advertisement that they placed in the Globe and Mail here on the right. The state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. And that ran as a full-page Globe and Mail ad in 1982 as the Right to Privacy Committee sent their own delegation to Parliament to try to repeal the law. They weren't successful. They left some work for me to do. And so me and Ron and Gary and several of the other activists, we went back to Parliament even after we demanded the expungement legislation be extended. And we were successfully able to get the body house law repealed in 2019. The questions, the second last question I have here is, who was responsible? As I get this a lot, ultimately, who gave the order? Was it the Premier, Bill Davis? Was it the Mayor, Art Eggleton? Was it the police chief, Jack Ackroyd? That's the protest signs here, Ackroyd out. You'll see the Nazi symbol, the swastika. That's because of those comments about gas coming out of the shower heads. So we see that imagery in a lot of these protest signs. And then here's Roy McMurtry being burned in effigy at that bloodbath protest in June 1981. Roy McMurtry was the Attorney General of Ontario at the time. There is no evidence to suggest Roy McMurtry gave the order or that he even knew about these raids. So I don't think it's him. And it also, I don't have any evidence that it's the police chief. What I believe is that it was the result of the next person down from the police chief, Staff Inspector Donald Banks. He was head of the morality and intelligence bureaus at the time. And he was the one who was responsible for coordinating not only the raids, but also the 6-month investigation leading up to them. Now, whether or not they told the police chief, I have a hard time believing that the police chief wouldn't have known that 200 of his agents were about to embark on a mass arrest. I just have a hard time believing that. I have a hard time believing that the Attorney General wouldn't have been notified at some point either. But whether or not they gave the order, I don't think so. I don't think it was either of those two. I think it was at the staff sergeant level. Finally, what is the connection to Black Lives Matter? And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this because this was so central to what was going on in 1981 with the community. At the February 20th, 1981 protest, one of the speakers, so that was a protest that wasn't just a ruckus destruction through the streets. There were several very articulate, intelligent speakers at the February 20th protest. There were at the February 6th protests as well, but February 20th was really about these speakers, and they spoke at Queen's Park. And one of the speakers was Lamona Johnson, pictured here. And she spoke at the February 20th, 1981 protest. She was the widow of Albert Johnson, a Black man who was murdered by police in 1979. And at the time, the members of the Right to Privacy Committee had joined with other groups, including civil rights activist Bromley Armstrong, in creating this new group in the city of Toronto that brought together gay activists and Black activists and women's organizations in order to fight back against police violence. And so this created enduring connections between the 2S LGBTQ community, as well as the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Now, while Lamona Johnson and Albert Johnson were in a heterosexual relationship, I always get a little bit frustrated that when we talk about these enduring connections between LGBTQ2 people and Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we often forget that there are queers who are also Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And one of the problems with that separation is that the history of queers in Canada, the history of LGBTQ2 communities in Canada, is so often told from the white perspective and through the white lens. And we need to be doing better at highlighting these connections to these other communities who have faced police violence and demonstrating the importance of those connections, because I kind of think that we've been forgetting sometimes. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Oh, Tristan, your mic is muted. Oh.
Of course I would do that. Well, thank you very much, Tom. That was just such an amazing presentation. You failed to disappoint again. Your presentation in October was great. This was absolutely fantastic. Along with the technical issues we were having getting the stream up, it seems to have also impacted our live chat features. So we won't have a lot of questions. I perhaps have a couple of maybe discussion points, and I'm sure they're loaded questions, and I'm sure you may have heard them in one way or another at one point. I'm sure, I don't know if maybe Sammy might have a few questions too. There's so much to really learn from this history, and sometimes you could look at a group like Pflag, and I'm sure at some point someone might come online and look at our stream and look at our YouTube channel, like, why is Pflag talking about the bathhouse raids of all things? More associated with parents supporting their kids and kids seeking support in those types of items. But what do you think are the lessons here of kind of knowing queer history and even local history, not really in such detail, but to be aware of the events and to really be able to correlate the themes and to possibly make connections into current lived experiences today. What's the impact of that, and why is that important to know?
When I think about a group like Pflag, that I think of a group that's sort of devoted to allyship and accompliceship, right? So that's one of the key takeaways of this story of the Bathhouse raids. Like I said, the activists who showed up tonight were expecting 50 people, and they were expecting the cops to double down on their police violence. Instead, what they saw was a sea of people beyond the horizon. Jim Monk, who was one of the people who spoke at the February 6th protest, said he couldn't see the end of the crowd because it was at night and it was dark and he couldn't see there were that many people. Those were not all community members. In fact, there was a huge number of them that were allies and accomplices. And I think the message of the resistance to the Bathhouse raids shows the power of allies and accomplices to this movement. And so groups, the energy and the efforts of groups like Pflag, you might not think about it in those terms, but those types of groups are so central to our community's history of activism that I think we really need to get back in touch with that, because it will demonstrate the importance of groups like this to the present.
I really enjoyed your correlation as well to Toronto's Pride celebrations as well. We often talk about, and it's becoming a little more popular, I'd say, to that point, that Pride was a protest. The first Pride was a riot, and we're starting to make those allusions back to our history. But it's so powerful to know that Toronto's Pride was also born out of that same activism from a local situation as well. It wasn't necessarily, it was inspired by Stonewall for sure, but to also, to say, okay, we're gonna reject, even back then they knew, and we're gonna reject any correlation with the 1969 legislation, and we're going to really stay true to the roots of what celebrating Pride and the march really is.
The one thing that I often hear is that the Toronto Bathhouse raids was Canada's Stonewall. Because of this moment, this local moment that you're referring to, in which there's this turning point, this shift in not only the type of activism that's happening, but the sheer number of activists who are engaging. And that's definitely true. But I don't like the comparison. I talk about this in my dissertation, that the comparison, calling it Canada's Stonewall, for one, it's a bit Toronto centric. Okay, that, like I said, that 1977 raid on the trucks in Montreal, I think Montreal would call that, a Stonewall moment. And so for Toronto to say, okay, our Bathhouse raids was Canada's Stonewall, is a little bit, well, it's true to form for Toronto, actually. I should do it. But, one of the things that it does for me is it kind of erases the importance of Stonewall in inspiring the response in 1981. To say this was Canada's Stonewall, well, actually, and this was one of my professors, Anne Rubenstein, said this, Stonewall was Canada's Stonewall because we took the lessons from it, and our activists, in fact, activists came across the border and inspired a new generation of activism. So I know you didn't make that comparison, to be fair to you, Tristan. I just saw an opportunity to talk about that comparison that I hear quite often.
It's funny that you say that, because I'm pretty sure somewhere in advertising, this evening in your talk that are on our social media platforms, I think somewhere I may have had that description somewhere. And then as you brought up the chart again with all of the bathhouse raids in Canada, everything that we know of, and I think that's even important to think of it too, that you have to dig to find this history, that it's it's not obvious, so you're not going to see it in a newspaper, or you have to really dig to find it. But I was even thinking about it during that chart. I'm like, well, you even have the Olympics cleanup, and that was specifically designed to try to erase the image and to erase queer people from the city before the Olympics even arrived. And so, and that happened at least probably 10 years, if that, maybe before Toronto's bathhouse raids. If my
Around
dates,
there, 1975 and 1976 was that cleanup campaign that was in both Ottawa and Montreal. So in both of those cities were caught up in that cleanup campaign. And you're right, this was not about the enforcement of the law. This was about destruction. They wanted these places closed. In their mind, Canada was hosting the world, and there was no place for queers. And so they had to do what they could to shut them down. The trucks in 1977, that was a bar. It was rated under the Body House law, but it wasn't even a bathhouse. It was a bar. Now, okay, it had what would be called in modern gay parlance a back room type deal, but it wasn't a bathhouse. And so the spaces in Montreal were being targeted very specifically by the police. And it extends all the way back to that Montreal Olympics cleanup.
Sammy, did you have any thoughts or questions that you wanted to add on there?
We did. So we kind of talked about the more legal ramifications of the arrest, as well as the push for the protests and everything. But in order to contextualize the Body House laws and the bathhouse raids, I was wondering what kind of social ramifications there were of the arrest on the individuals, such as with their marriage, with work, with employment, and all of that.
Yeah, those are a lot of difficult conversations occurred in the days and weeks after that, when for the men who were like Duncan or Arthur, where they had marriages, they had families at home, and their private escape was now suddenly on the front page. And so this was very awkward. I don't know any individuals who I know did this, but there are reports in the news from 1981 that 2 men who were arrested committed suicide. And there was, a number of relationships that were destroyed, and a number of men who went into deep depression. That included Arthur, by the way. Arthur was scared out of his mind after this. He wanted to hide under the covers in bed. And so I think thinking about that mind space, Arthur, who didn't have a violent interaction and who was released the night of with his ticket, he was traumatized by this. So there is definitely an element of trauma here that often gets overlooked. When you're someone like Duncan and you hear cops making concentration camp jokes, and you're standing there in a shower room in nothing but a towel with a whole bunch of men who are also in nothing but a towel, and you're being mocked. That's really tough. Ron is Jewish. And so he definitely took to heart these, and his cousin was there. He was Jewish too. And they took to heart these comments and this allusion to fascist Germany. So between the trauma and all of the verbal abuse and the physical abuse, we're looking at a lot of consequences for the men who were caught up. Not to mention the men who were roughed up during the protests at the police station, the men who were hospitalized because they were hit over the head with billy clubs. These have long-term consequences on these individuals. Now, many of them channeled that rage into action and activism. But we also know that trauma takes another toll that doesn't get reported and celebrated. And I think your question is really dead on. We need to remember that darker side more often.
Thank you for sharing.
We won't take too much of your time now, Tom, owing to the difficulties earlier. We've stolen your night away, your Wednesday night away. But thank you so much for joining us here tonight. This was absolutely amazing. I know a lot of our service users are going to love looking back on this presentation. We're definitely going to be linking it for weeks and months to come for sure. So thank you again for sharing us your time, your research, your knowledge, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And like I said at the start, if anybody listening to this has any experiences from this time, please contact me, because I know a lot of people who went to the BAS, they lived in New York region, and they may live in York region now, so, or at the protests. So yeah, I would love to speak to anyone who has that experience. But otherwise, look for my book that'll probably come out in, I don't know, academic publishing, maybe 2 years, but we'll see.
Oh, I'll be looking. Oh, well, keep in touch. I want to read.
Oh,
that.
I'll definitely send the announcement for sure.
Yes, we will all be looking forward to that. I personally am.
All righty. Well, take care. Have a good night.
Have a good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
For everyone who may be watching on our live stream, we're going to be launching into our support meeting in just a few minutes. So we hope to see you there, and thank you for checking with us tonight.